Welcome to one more event of the series of debates on restitution and reparation in post-conflict identity here at the CCFM YouTube channel. My name is Caroline Brugger from the German Mozambican Cultural Center, Goethe Center, Maputo. So after 3 national debates and the opening of the parallel exhibition based on the research of the anthropologist Marie-Louise Wane, which happened yesterday, we are now starting the first international debate on the topic of restitution as activism with case studies from Kenya and South Africa. I want to thank Oficina da História de Moçambique and Mbenga Artes e Reflexões to bring us this series of events, also the CCFM for the partnership, and especially today the Goethe Institute Kenya in Nairobi and Africano Filter Foundation and the donors of the crowdfunding campaign Rise Up Mozambique, who gave the support for this Anglophone debate we are having today. And for this session, we are warmly welcoming 3 speakers from South Africa: Siraj Rasool, University of the Western Cape; from the Nest Collective from Kenya, Nairobi, Jim Chuchu; and from Shift Collective based in France and Germany, Simone Ritmeyer; and also our moderator for this evening, Katharina Simão. So let me give a short introduction of the 3 speakers. Of course, their biographies are much larger, and you can get additional details on the project homepage. For example, I will be focusing only on the information that is really relevant for the debate we are having tonight. So I will start with Simone Ritmeyer. Simone is video artist and filmmaker with works between documentary and also fiction that explore the power of moving images and their political impact. And since 2018, he is part of the multidisciplinary art collective Shift, as I said before, based in Germany and France, that has created installations, photography works, film, and is part of a project called the International Inventories Program. We will explain later in the event what is this program actually and in more detail. But I just want to say that within this program, he's working together with German and Kenyan museums and also with the Nest Collective, which is bringing me to our next guest, Jim Chuchu. So Jim is also filmmaker and musician and visual artist and living and working in Nairobi, Kenya. And in 2014, he co-founded the Nest Collective I mentioned before, which is a multidisciplinary art collective based in Nairobi, which creates films, music, fashion, visual arts, and literature. And currently, Jim is also serving as the co-funding director of the Nest Collective. And so to repeat this information, the Shift Collective and the Nest Collective, they are together in the International Inventories Program. And I wanted to say something, it's a bit above the scope of this event, but I would like to add, because this year in October, we already had an event which was linked to Jim, as we were showing one of the films of the Nest Collective, a queer film called Stories of Our Lives, which was quite critically acclaimed in Kenya and actually even banned for being accused of promoting homosexuality. But despite of this ongoing ban, the film has been screened in over 80 countries and also won awards, for example, the Jury Prize at the Berlinale in 2015. And I'm very happy that we managed also to show the film here in Mozambique and even in a Portuguese version. So it's nice to have you here now, Jim, once again. And now I'm coming to our 3rd speaker, the 3rd very special guest, Siraj Rasool. He is professor at of history at the University of the Western Cape and directs its African program in museum and heritage studies. He is an associated member of the Global South Studies Center at the University of Cologne in Germany and also member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Lushan Collection, also in Germany, Berlin. And he has been in the boards of very important museums and has also previously chaired the scientific committee of the International Council of African Museums and currently serves on the high-level Museums Advisory Committee of the UNESCO. So these are our 3 speakers for today. I also would like to introduce a bit our moderator, Katharina Simão. She is a Portuguese artist and researcher who lives and works between Maputo and Lisbon. Already in the first edition of this event, which took place in May 2019, also at the CCFM, she was at the organization team, and also this year in the second edition, she is co-organizing the event again. And so I just will pass to you, Catalina, and you can open our debate for tonight. Thanks a lot.
Hello to all of you. Boa tarde. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Caroline, for introducing the speakers, and at the end for bringing us together to this debate today. So I should say that after the intervention of the speakers, we will have space for questions from the audience at home, and the audience can use the chat from the YouTube channel. So also important is to say that the questions can be done in Portuguese or in English, because we will translate immediately. Thank you so much, you all, for coming today and participating in this fourth debate of the cycle. I would love to start with Seraj with the first question. So in 2019, when we organized the first seminar on restitution of cultural heritage here in Mozambique, we were very concerned with a pedagogical approach to this topic. We asked a few Mozambican authors to introduce the different meanings for concepts like restitution, rescue, return, repatriation, and so on. So although this was really useful for the young, we were a little bit criticized by the generation of people, the oldest people that lived through the transition to independence here in Mozambique. So they claimed that those concepts and practices were not new in the Mozambican culture policies. So my question is linked to this claim. Can you tell what is this close relation between concept of restitution of cultural heritage and societies that live through a liberation struggle, like Mozambique, and also, of course, like South Africa? Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here tonight, and I apologize for my dogs wanting to enter the conversation. This is their barking time of the evening. It's very interesting how we use different concepts for this idea of return, and how the idea of restitution has come to mean different things. In South Africa, I like to think of restitution as one of a set of R words that are happening simultaneously and that need to be thought of together. Of restitution, of reparations, of reconciliation. Sometimes these are accounting terms like reconciliation. And restitution is something that we use in South Africa to refer to the return of land that has been taken away from you. But we also use it, and we are increasingly using it, to refer to the return of material culture, human remains, and documentation, such as sound recordings, film, audio collections, and I suppose even archival materials. And another concept is used in some societies as a synonym for restitution, and they use the term repatriation. Now, each of these terms has a peculiar meaning. Repatriation tends to be used when there is a contest of sovereignty. So in the United States and Canada, indigenous people And the whole subject of the return of human remains and material culture of indigenous people is usually spoken about as repatriation, because in legal terms, it might be a bit of a fiction, but the reservations that were allocated to the conquered indigenous people of the United States and Canada have in some sense, sovereignty. If we talk about Australia, their indigenous people do not accept the authority of their national government to be the receiving institutions of material culture that have been appropriated from them as a result of colonialism. So we need to just think about these terms. Restitution, well, I think repatriation also has some unfortunate aspects to it. It tends to be a kind of masculinist term, the return to the fatherland, but it also tends to involve a statist government-to-government kind of return to the fatherland, and that it is restitution considered purely in a national perspective, in a perspective of state-to-state relationships. Restitution is also very interesting in that it is a concept that refers to a process of claims making. That is why restitution is important, because it imagines that there is a claim that is delivered. And it is very important that restitution not be thought of merely as a project of European gift making. Yes, we do need to work with Europeans. We need to benefit from their inventories. We need to benefit from their provenance research, but we must lead these claims as Africans, because this is about the dignity of African people. And so the claims making is a very important process. At the same time, we cannot think of restitution simply as an event of return. Restitution is a project. It is a program. It is a restorative program. In the same way as reparations is not just a financial payout to compensate for a loss. It might be some kind of payout to enable some kind of fresh start. It is not about making a quantification of the value of the injury and placing a monetary value on loss. It is about reparatory work, because this all signals work that we have to do. Here, of course, Namibia and its relationship with Germany is very important for us in Southern Africa, because here you have a very interesting situation of an enduring colonialism that for a long time, a memory of which was lost in Germany, because they had subsequent traumas to deal with. And our German colleagues keep on talking about colonialism as a period. So they talk about a period of colonialism, that, whereas for us, colonialism is an enduring experience. It is, yes, we've had liberation struggles. Yes, for the most part, the countries on the African continent became free. In the 1960s, in Southern Africa, we had weaker settler, we had peculiar colonialism, and you had later independences emerging in settler colonies. And of course, you had South Africa as a colony of a special type marked by an internal colonialism. So colonialism is not something that went away. It is enduring. Colonialism did not go away when African countries became free. In a formal sense, yes, Europeans did not rule over African people. And we know from our social analysis of what happened with independence, we know that that was also marked by what we call neo-colonialism. That's a different form of colonialism, that we have the maintenance of economic colonialism or imperialism, but formal political rule is transferred to the local elites in an African society. And it's more complicated than that. It varies from one society to another. We have all kinds of problems of when ruling parties become, of when liberation movements become ruling parties, and the statism that emerges and so forth. But the main way in which colonialism has endured is as knowledge systems, as disciplines. And these have come to be frozen as if that is the natural order of the world. And because we are talking about museums, museums are the preeminent institutions of empire and colonialism and coloniality. Museums are marked by disciplines. And the people of the world were divided into the disciplines of the people with history and the disciplines of the people deemed to be without history. And you had this emergence of this deep legacy that we have to contend with, of the ethnographic, of the ethnological, of the rule over people through the ethnological, and the creation of the ethnological or the ethnographic museum as part of the disempowerment of the people. So that on the African continent, go from one country to another, these ethnographic museums are in a state of decay because they do not speak to the people and people do not see themselves in it. And so we have huge challenges here as we think about these categories and their meaning, where restitution is an opportunity for us in this age of restitution to remake our societies, to reimagine who we are as Africans, as human beings, to reimagine our relationships with other societies, such as those that colonized us and those that were also involved in our colonialism, but did not colonize us directly. So it is a very important set of opportunities that we have here to work on collections, to think about what it will mean to do restitution and what restitution means, that restitution is not an event of return. Restitution is the basis. It forms the basis of a new museology, where the museum is not merely the collection, it is the discussion and the debate about the collection. It is the presence of people to engage the collection. And we have museums without collections. We have museums that are memorial museums, museums that work in relation to the memories of people, of their trauma. And so the museum is an opportunity to mobilize people, to empower them, to give them a greater sense of participation in the decision-making over their own lives. And the museum mustn't simply be a statist institution that is bound up with the government over the people. I know you have a follow-up question, Katarina.
I have. Actually, it's based on a talk I heard you I think a couple of years ago. So you said the future of the museum is based on the return. We need to rethink the place of the object. So, of course, you already introduced this a little bit, but could you develop a little bit what is happening in South Africa in terms of this returning? What is required as an epistemic work in this case? And also, if you can develop this into, also technical problems and legal problems.
Okay, thank you. So, as you can imagine, a society such as South Africa becoming democratic or undergoing its complicated democratization with deviations and all kinds of problems along the way, pitfalls, and sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot and that kind of thing. But one of the first problems that had to be addressed in the National Museum is the division between the ethnographic and cultural history of what kinds of knowledge systems are appropriate for white people and their material culture that are placed into a narrative of Europe that culminates in Cape Town, and what happens in the museum of the different categories of Black people, of how so-called African people were governed through tribe and so-called Khoisan people were governed through race. And you have the division between physical anthropology and cultural anthropology, and of a focus on the body and on collecting the remains of the dead to be placed in museums as so-called fossils, as the remains of a supposed dying race. And then you have done it precisely by the work of the state ethnologist Van Warmelo. You had the museum coming to arrange material culture tribe by tribe, just as that very same official made the decision on who was a tribe and who was not a tribe. And so there are some very important projects underway at the moment in which the National Museum has developed a new collections division called Social History. I don't know why they called it that. They could have called it something else, but they called it Social History, which is where you have the very important epistemic work taking place of bringing together formerly segregated collections. You also have another research project underway about what the scholars call untribing the archive. So you think about collections and you think about its record in the museum and in the archive, and you think about how you do a critique of tribalization. But then you also have a project of restitution underway, and we have had false starts. We have had two major examples of restitution. One in 2002 involving the return of Sarah Baartman from Paris, from the collection of the Musée de l'Homme, involving a very complicated process of negotiation between South Africa and France and the passing of a new law, but a process that showed that it is possible for France to find a way out of what it says is its legal problem, that its collections are inalienable. So it is possible. So there is a legal side to restitution work and claims making. There is also a policy side to restitution work and claims making. In the last few months, the national policy on restitution of human remains and material culture and documentation has been accepted by the South African Parliament. And I am a new member of the advisory board of the Committee on Restitution and Repatriation that will be located within the South African Heritage Resources Agency. We will have our first meeting on the 3rd of December. And some of the important things that we have learned already as we have undertaken restitution. We also undertook an ad hoc restitution process of the return of the remains of Klaas and Troy Pinaar, whose bodies had been illegally disinterred from their graves on a farm called Pienaarspitz near Kuruman in the Northern Cape by an Austrian anthropologist and his South African assistants, but who on the same expeditions were also collecting culture, were making film, were making sound recordings. And all of these collections have been distributed through the museum system in Vienna. We also have the example of a Polish anthropologist, Czekanowski, At the same time, having made documentation, recordings, and collected human remains from Eastern Africa, the German East Africa, in the territory of what is now Rwanda. The trouble with the programs on restitution that are happening now is human remains have been completely separated from material culture, because we assume that material culture should be in a project of care and of humaneness. We do accept that human remains should not be in the museum, and there is no authority, and it is unethical, and they must be returned immediately. That is where we are currently with the Germans, with the Dutch, with the Belgians, and so forth. But we find that division between material culture and human remains is an artificial one. And so I'm very thankful that our policy has involved both, because restitution is not a general claim, give everything back. It is, these claims have to be researched. We know there are very clear cases of looting and of violence, and everyone here must be watching the program that is unfolding almost every week on Benin bronzes, on the violence of how those bronzes and how those artworks were acquired, and how they got distributed throughout Europe in museums through the operation of the market, and how different museums in Europe, university museums in England and Scotland are making decisions on return. And you know that there is currently a museum being prepared in Nigeria for the return of Benin bronzes. So return, there are examples of looting and violence, but we also have to think about restitution when it involves the operation of the other forms of control and power under colonialism. And we need to think about restitution not just potentially as a return to a new monumental museum, such as what we have at the moment in Senegal. We have a new museum, a grand musée of Black cultures, and we have a new great museum of Africa being prepared in Algeria. So that is one model. We need to think about other models of what restitution means, because the most important work that restitution has to do is to bring a new dignity, to enable people to rejoice in their humanity, and to enable, in the words of Sarr and Savoy, who wrote the report for Emmanuel Macron, that enables a new relational ethics. Unmute.
Hello again, sorry. Thank you so much, Siraj. So I think your time is complete for now. I will come back to you after we speak about with Jim and Simon that are waiting. So hello again, Simon and Jim. Thank you so much for again for your presence here. So individually, you have very different and quite exceptional creative practices as filmmakers and as artists. But on the other hand, you are part of collectives where other researchers and people coming from academy also work. You both are part of a project called International Inventories Program that defines itself as an international research and database project that has so far cataloged an inventory of 30,000 Kenyan cultural objects held in museums and public institutions around the world. And I'm quoting. So this is really amazing. And of course, we will want you to tell us more about this project, how it all started, who are the partners in this project, and which countries and which museums are involved. And also, why not, where does the money come from to enable this kind of project? But before that, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to hear also about this focus on inventory. Why is this so necessary? And also why is it so important, interesting? And also, how is a practice that is part of this tradition in museography, as cataloging, inventory, is now also in the hands of artists' collectives?
Thank you, Catalina, and thank you, Siraj, for providing such a fiery context for this conversation. I can give a brief overview of how the Iip project started. I think we met Simone and other members of the Shift Collective in early 2018 and came together to do a series of workshops that were quite naive, I have to say, in their construction at the beginning, because all of us were just interested in the question of object return, but without any of the specifics about how that can happen and what particular challenges Kenya was facing. After a couple of workshops, we quickly learned that the National Museums of Kenya were at the time grappling with the question of which Kenyan objects are out there, how many are they, and where are they? And around this time, the AFRICOM, the Association of African Museums, was asking the constituent museums whether they have archives, whether they have inventories of what's out there. And Kenya, as we were told by the National Museums of Kenya, Kenya did not know where those objects were and had always treated objects that were outside as cultural ambassadors, which was kind of a very moderate position that the government had taken around objects, which is kind of typical for Kenya to take a very moderate position whenever we are in international circles. To us, that position was at the nest. To us, the position was comical because we find the idea of objects that have been taken without the consent of the makers becoming cultural ambassadors. We find that a little bit of a stretch, diplomatically and politically. And so we then came together as the Nest and Shift Collective, National Museums of Kenya, two museums in Germany, the WKM in Frankfurt and the RJM in Cologne, all shielded or kind of supported administratively by the Goethe Institute in Nairobi. And so over a series of more than 2 years now, we worked to reach out to all these museums across Europe and America and beyond, asking them if they had collections of objects. Many institutions did not respond, but about 31 or 35 that have responded have sent data, and that is where the number of 32,000 objects came about. And I suppose maybe the R word that I would add to Siraj's excellent kind of breakdown would be race and relations, because the work of restitution, repatriation, and all those do involve relations, and race is always kind of the hidden question underneath that. And so, of course, the construction of the Iip project from the very first day already had those kind of race and relation questions, because one of the questions that we heard often was why is this project funded by the Germans? Why is there no African money supporting the restitution work? And that's a question that continues to be relevant and pertinent, even though I, as Jane, do feel like the work of restitution should be borne by the culprits who have caused a lot of harm, and that's to ask African countries to spend money on making these claims and pursuing this dialogue industry and bureaucracies to return objects seems like, to ask the victim to pay for the justice. So that's a question that I easily discard, while other people do consider it quite seriously. So in the 2 years, for us as an nest, it was quite a new subject for us, but we quickly saw that that there were aspects of these relationships that were not accounted for. For us, it was the emotional quotient that was quite difficult, because we quickly realized that for Europeans dealing with this subject, the emotional landscape is one of guilt, maybe, if you're lucky. Whereas the emotional landscape for people asking for objects and doing the work of restitution and claims making is one of resentment and anger, because you do have to troll through some very disturbing texts and ideas in order to find some kind of logic that can allow you to make those claims or to ask for data. And so for us at the Nest, it was quite difficult to read some of these texts and to engage with museum kind of structures that have never asked themselves these difficult questions in many cases. We did receive data from museums that sometimes was troubling to read in terms of how, I think Siraj has mentioned about the tribalization of object data. So we did find a lot of problematics in the data. And for me personally, it was very interesting to encounter the question of capacity, which is one that is often lobbed at African museums. If we return these objects, do you have the capacity to conserve them? I find that question problematic, illogical, unfair, because for many reasons. One being that that the capacity to conserve should not be a precursor to the validity of claims. I think that's an artificial bureaucratic kind of framework to look at these relations. And I think that the revenues that museums earn from having these collections is a critical component of the capacity that European museums can be said to have. And so it is unfair to ask African museums that do not have the same revenues because they do not have those collections to then somehow subsidize their capacity building in some way. So I think for us, we were very interested in these emotional quotients because we realized that Europe is not taking the emotions of the people who are asking for objects seriously. Whether it's the Greeks, whether it's the Asians, whether it's the Africans, it seems that Europe finds the emotional quotient to be something easy to discard. And you can see it in the language of exchange right now, in the ways that France wants to dictate the tone of exchange between them and the countries by saying that these are not acts of repentance, but more acts of friendship. I don't see how you can be friendship, how you can have a friendship that is not based on equal relations. I find those tonal issues quite disturbing. I should pass the mic to Simone because I think Simone then has the unique kind of perspective of European partners in an international partnership around exchange. And what I have given is kind of my perspective as someone on the side that's asking for the objects.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Thanks, Katharina, for the invitation. Thanks to Siraj. I'm happy to be here with you. Yeah, I something that you said about race and the relationship that we developed in the process of the International Inventories Program in our group of actors and partners somehow for me crystallizes the underlying questions of power relationship and communication that is an international and transnational project. So already in our very first workshop in Nairobi, the privilege for me as a white male coming from Europe, having the possibility to travel to Nairobi to participate in the workshop with you shows pretty clearly that from the very beginning we are in an unequal relationship, and this we had to deal a lot in the project itself with this let's say historical and global inequalities. So when you mention when you said that we started naively in the first workshop, I would totally agree. On many levels we were naive, But it was, on the other hand, it was a very nice moment because we were open. We were not sure about how this project should develop. We didn't have any goals that were defined. We were just meeting and thinking together. And then we realized, what does it mean to really restitute one single object? What does it mean to really do this kind of a 3-year project that deals with these issues? And we could have stopped many times on our way because it was so discouraging, or it was so frustrating to understand that even moving one very, let's say, cheap object from the collection in Cologne that was bought on a market in the 1960s or 70s, and that has no importance at all for the museum in Germany. To move this single object from Germany to Kenya would have been an undertaking that could take 1 year and would involve work, power, and energy of so many people. And but then still to go on, and I think this is something very nice that came out of this constellation of actors, that we constantly had to realize the inequalities, and we constantly had to face, like in the moment when, for example, I, as a citizen of the city of Cologne, decide to walk into the museum, I can easily ask for access to the storerooms. I can easily ask for access to the information, whereas our partners from Kenya were really surprised that they were granted access when we entered for the first time to the stores. And they were happy, or they were, how can I say, grateful. Whereas now, and this was a learning process, and I think a personal learning process for all of us. Whereas now we developed some kind of a self-confidence that, of course, we have the right to access these stores. Of course, we have the right to access these informations. And so I think the project is a lot about access for me when I speak from the European side, and to understand more and more that the museums, as Siraj was pointing out very nicely, they are in a moment of decay. The ethnographic museums face a substantial crisis of their own right to exist. So one way would be to close them down, and to, what, I don't know, put something else on their place. Or what's more likely to happen is that they have to reinvent themselves. And I think one part of this process is that also the citizens in Germany are more and more asking for access and for the museums to open up. And this, we could really nicely see this during the process of Iip, because I remember us writing the first letters to the German museums, asking a very simple list of Kenyan objects that they have in their collections. And I remember us being very, how do you say, we didn't ask for much. We were really like, only basic informations, please. We don't want to know the former collector that gave it. We didn't ask for names. We didn't ask for all the archives that they have about these objects. We were just interested in very simple, basic informations. And this was because we had doubts that they could even answer. And then we realized that the museums themselves are under much pressure. There's more and more questions coming, and they are confronted with a lot of, I would say, the debate. You know, even the people that are working in the museums since years, they are confronted with a new situation. So today, after this process, we are even receiving letters from museums that are interested in explaining and telling us about their collections, and that so the situation switched completely. So I think this, for me as the German partner, it's much about self-confidence and this touches your question, Katharina, as an artist, or let's say outsider who is not part of the museum, who's not a museum professional, to understand that this is something where we can be active, where we can do something by very simple means, which is asking about access, asking about the history of these specific collections, and then of course connected to this question of the history, also to realize that the German colonial past is something that is less discussed, is not enough, it's not well known and not well taught. So there is a lot of work ahead of us in Germany.
Great, thank you so much, Simon. Well, we have time to continue a little bit our conversation. And of course, many questions emerge on my head, but so you talk mainly about this relationship between, let's say, the two collectives around this process that was unknown at the beginning. You didn't know exactly how to proceed. You wanted to discover this within the process. And I also had, some experience on this kind of the questions you can put to museums. And sometimes it's very hard for museums to understand what they can gain about on answering this question or making this effort. Can you develop a little bit about this?
I think just to answer the question and to also add on what Simon said, I think one of the roles that the artistic collectives, and maybe I would even call them activistic collectives, because upon entering the project, I felt like the artist collectives were the ones that had the most radical positions, because for us it was just clear-cut logic. There's a crime that has happened here, and the only way to fix it is to, return it and, repay. Like for us, the answers are quite clear. But for the museums and for everyone else, there are all these bureaucratic and political reasons why things are not as simple. And so it felt to me like the wider narrative of the Iip project was how do positions shift with the more knowledge that you acquire. For us, it was what happens to us when we have access to the conservation departments, because we did get to see the behind the scenes of museums and get to understand all the other things that contribute to these bureaucratic positions that museums take. Did they soften our activistic positions? I would say yes, a little bit, because now we started to see that museums are people, systems are people, and that sometimes bureaucratic walls have more to do with administration rather than intention. And as for the museums, I'm very happy to report that the National Museums of Kenya became quite a lot more activistic after the Iip project, even though they were quite worried about us in the beginning. It is now very, very heartening to hear the museum staff to drop this idea of cultural ambassadors, and for that position to also start to affect the museum, the government policy in Kenya, who are now starting to become a bit more serious about looking for objects that have been in demand from communities for a long time. And so I guess that's one of the ways in which these international relationships can soften, but also harden where positions must become harder. The other thing that I think we easily brought to the group was the question of emotion and reason and intellect, because it was very often that the museum people would kind of obsess about the materialism of the objects, about the provenance and all that. But for us, it was by keeping these objects, you are preventing Kenya from sorting out many of its identity issues, and our identity issues are a source of a lot of conflict. So it was much easier for us to sit there as citizens and say, this is not good for our country, it is not good for our people to not have these objects. And I can give examples. The questions around feminism and queer rights and all those other very difficult subjects in the African continent could be softened so much by objects. I remember seeing some smoking pipes that the museums had. And on the European side, those are just like ethnographic curiosities. But in Kenya, for those pipes to be attributed to women and leisure, it's such a strong thing, because right now, if you're a Kenyan woman who smokes, a lot can be said about you. That's not positive, that's not fair. And so for Kenyan women to be able to say, but our ancestors did this with their leisure time, they smoked. Why? Which frame is this that we are using to say that women cannot smoke? You know, that's an example of how some of these absences can seem so, you know, small, but can really shape a country. So for me, the question about inventories doesn't so much interest me in terms of like the anthropological data. That's not what really matters to me. What really matters to me is that I did not know that my tribe had dancing ceremonies, because right now my tribe are not associated with anything musical, anything to do with leisure, because of what happened during colonialism. How do I restore that spirit of dance, of music to my tribe, if the objects that speak to the evidence of that culture are not there? This is how objects, and it's really disheartening to see Europe obsess with the materiality of objects and not see how those are connected to the memory and identity of people on this side.
We normally see this discussion divided between objects and documentation, like archives. But sometimes you're right, you know, European museums have this tendency to see an object also as document. So I think this is a reason why they relate basically towards a knowledge about the object as if it was the key for a document. And I was wondering about, you know, I was in my mind listening to some questions in the team of the organization of this debate. We always talk about this position of weakness, sometimes that countries that have not so much economic power to really activate this knowledge in terms of who will tell better about this object from my tribe, if not this European museum. Maybe this knowledge is already lost here, and I depend on what these anthropologists, these PhD people come and tell. Did you have this experience too? I mean, that you have to wait to see what is the anthropologic research made about an object to then reflect about its meaning in the community?
Absolutely. I feel there are many points where the team at the National Museums of Kenya saw the data that was coming in from the museums and were immediately feeling like that's not correct. And would get into conversation with the museums and say, this tribal attribution is not correct. The description of this object is not correct. The use is not correct. I found those exchanges a little bit unfair, because it's one thing to have objects, and it's another thing to ask the people who made those objects to give you more information to enrich your archives, but have no discussion about the movement. I find that like a very unequal exchange of labor and knowledge. So I'm not really in favor of that exchange. Maybe just to bring another example, I watched recently the other thing that happened where the Germans sent back, I think, a Bible and a whip to Namibia, and they sent it back in this temperature-controlled business class flight. And And then as soon as this lady comes off the plane with this like very elaborate box, the people just open the box and take out the book and like pass it around. And for me, that was such an example of the ways in which we have this disciplines that Siraj talked about, how we organize the world around disciplines and that don't necessarily relate to how people actually behave. So I've always been interested in what does conservation for me is only useful in a culture that destroys. And so is it wrong for people to touch objects? Because like, I feel even in the Kenyan museum, like Kenyans are always being told, don't touch the objects, stop touching the objects. And I'm always curious about this as a way of being. Is it that the societies that made objects are not afraid to touch them because they can always make more of them? Whereas museums that are holding objects that they did not make have to be much more careful because they cannot make more of them. And so they draw these yellow lines and tell people don't touch. And the objects have to be, preserved in temperature control. I wonder whether museums of the future, particularly museums in Africa and the global South generally, can have a different idea around what people are allowed to do with objects. What's the point of having a whole collection of masks if people cannot wear them? What's the point of having a whole collection of costumes if people cannot use them, cannot hear the instruments? So I'm not really in favor of this idea where European museums put things on the walls and in glass cases. I say to them, guys, it's because you didn't make these things.
Super. Just one last question, more directed to Simon, because it comes from a little bit the conversation we had previous to this day when we were preparing. And you were telling me about, some of the cases we worked, not all the objects that you studied or that you were dealing with were in custody of the countries that did or had this historical violence that involved the objects. And do you want to develop a little bit about this correspondence or non-correspondence and why this is maybe important?
Am I getting you right that you speak about objects that are not anymore in the let's say country of origin? In this, no,
I'm sorry. I wanted to refer to this situation, for example, where it was a British Empire that looted some objects, but then they end up in German museums, and then is Germany that deal with a restitution of this object without the involvement of the country that had an episode of violence around this object.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. First of all, I think we were somehow away from the, let's say, very critical confrontation that is, of course, happening between the British Museum and Kenyan actors. And I think it's today it can be quite frustrating to be an activist who is close to the British Museum and trying to do something there. So there is, this project became possible because we were actors that have different histories, and one of our, let's say, for example, Namibia was named. It would have been totally different to have this project between Tanzania and Germany, etc. So it's connected to the history of trade, and Germany still holds an extreme number of ethnographic objects, and I wouldn't say that it makes sense to distinguish between the UK and Germany. And what we observe today is that the main colonial powers, they are confronted with their history, and in Europe we have now each country is struggling with how to deal with it, and each country is doing it differently. And yeah, so but in our case, I think it was an advantage. And of course, at one point, we also approached the British Museum, and it was quite interesting to see their reaction. First of all, we had to wait for a very long time to get an answer. And then the answer was not really an answer that was easy to understand, because it was kind of an invitation to visit them. And we were just asking for a list of objects. And so until today, there is no real exchange of information. But at some point, we just decided that the information is available online, and this act of the British Museum to publish their data online enables us to integrate them into our database. So there is ways of engaging differently with these heritages also, which can be a digital heritage. It can be knowledge. There is so many ways of how to confront these histories. Yeah.
I would love to, in the future, to have a conversation about this digital possibility too, but maybe this is not the right forum for it. So I have here the information that there is no questions. Oh yes, there is one question. I would like to know how the debate, how in academia, this debate of restitution is happening in Kenya. Like, and the person mentions the question put at to Siraj just at the beginning. Okay, someone from Kenya should should answer this.
I think one of the things that we learned during this project was that that Europeans don't seem to be aware that this issue is deeply emotive on a public level in Africa. That you can stop a random Kenyan on the street and ask them about objects, and they will have an opinion, and it'll probably be in favor of return of objects. We learned this when a couple of the German museums visited Nairobi for our debates, and were surprised at the level of intense debate that the public came in to the room with, despite not needing us to contextualize anything. They were already in an activistic place. And I think that's an important thing for Europe to understand, that this is a public issue in Africa. It is not an academic issue. It is not a museum issue. It is not a cultural, it is not limited to the corridors of elite cultural discussion. And I think that means that it's unfortunate that we have to wait for the publics in Europe to gain a similar kind of level of outrage. And we know that that's very difficult because most European countries are not teaching their publics about what colonialism was like. And as Siraj mentioned, that colonialism was not a period, that it ends, that it continues, that it is in my language, it is in my name right now. I have an English name. Why should I have an English name? And so the anger is quite palpable in Kenya. And it is only, and it's actually much dimmer in our governments, because our governments are subservient to the need, to the governments of Europe, because that's where they're getting money for public services and money to send to the Cayman Islands or whatever. But that quite kind of quiet government response should not fool Europeans into thinking that we don't care about this issue. And
so basically,
as I said,
you don't think it's possible to develop this for now within the academy in Kenya? This is really a militancy issue.
Yes, and I think it is even worth noting that militancy is very interesting, because it is not taught to us in our education systems. We are not taught to be angry about this. So this is kind of more a natural justice question, if you believe in the idea of natural justice. I also don't like to look at Europe as I don't like it when Europeans split themselves into countries so they can escape the culpability of themselves as a society. So I'm not interested in those questions of like the Germans are more activistic about their history and the British are not. I think I'm interested in the net position, and the net position is not great. Yeah, mostly because of the British, who are the villains in a lot of these narratives, particularly the British Museum.
Great. So Siraj, I think you have some comments to the work of these two young men.
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, it's just so amazing to listen to my colleagues and to learn and to think about the complexities that they're talking about, and especially the work of artists and the work of museum professionals, and what happens when you bring these together, and how it is that as a result of this work, my colleague Juma Ondeng was the speaker about the International Inventories Project, who comes from the National Museums of Kenya. So I think it's wonderful work that you've done, because I mean, part of the colonial order that we find ourselves in the museum sector involves legacies of philanthropy and of development assistance that requires African museum professionals to be technicians and carers, not scholars. Scholarship is something that happens in Europe. There are many examples of these contradictions that we have. And so we have built multilateral museum coordinating structures that got decimated by the politics of philanthropy, and especially by the way the British Museum started taking that money, and how museums got caught up in these kind of webs of diplomacy and of neo-colonialism, essentially. And what's been very interesting is to watch the progress of the German work in what they call Provenienzforschung, in provenance research, that was done at different German museums in different cities that are governed by the locality, and how what was beginning to emerge was a very clear process that we can only describe as ethnographization of collecting happening in Namibia in the midst of a genocide. And you ask yourself the question, when you see the provenance that the object was brought by a soldier, did you kill first and collect later, or did you collect first and kill secondly? And how these objects were placed in the category of the ethnographic. They were made ethnographic or ethnological. They were ethnographized, and where the ethnological acted as an alibi for genocide. So ordinarily, we would think of these as genocide collections belonging to a history of violence and murder on a mass scale. But instead we think of them through the category of care of the object. And so the very contradiction of the museum comes up here, caught between its supposed caring function, which almost acts ideologically as giving the museum its validity and its authority, but then also needing to be an institution of public education and access, caught between these contradictions and these dynamics, and needing to work its way through that, but ultimately saying that its main priority is to care for collections. And some of them said they care for the collections on behalf of the whole world, on behalf of all the people of the world. So don't come and ask for it back. So we've been through all of these debates about the presence of these objects in the museums in the main museums of Europe, and we are now at a different stage. Okay, we in different places, we are in different positions. There's been acceleration with regard to Benin. There might be acceleration with regard to Magdala of Ethiopia. The activism of the International Inventories Program, the work of the Museum of British Colonialism are influencing the debates in Kenya, and they are creating a much wider activist platform. In South Africa, our activism has been about history museums. It's been about memorial museums, about site museums. Our most important museums work with experiences of apartheid on the land, dispossession, local history. Our national museums have had activism, such as Robben Island Museum, but they're all kind of caught up in governmentality and statism and the tourist imaginaries of the state and earning money. And so we have enormous problems turning those and maintaining those spaces as activists. There's been a measure of activism in the National Museum, such as Iziko, as I mentioned before, and that's internal activism. And we need the activists present in all of this. And it's interesting that the main activists have tended to be artists, that it is the performance art and maybe the visual arts that have produced the activists who have seen the need for activations and that have seen the need to intervene. And, you know, there is also a meta level at which we can operate here, like some curators, such as Mark Dion, have done in other parts of the world, where you critique the museum through engaging with its collection, and you present an exhibition that is about the way in which it has constructed itself and the way it's constructed its meanings. And you do the work of active deconstruction of what they do. So we need the activism, because we need, and as we do this work, the work that Jim and his colleagues do is the work of what our Portuguese speakers call, you know, in Brazil, but also in Lisboa, they call it a social museology. It's very interesting that category as a domain of museum work has not emerged in English. It's emerged in Portuguese and Spanish. It's emerged in the work of a radical museology in Brazil and elsewhere in Colombia. And it's that I see as an interventionist, a social museology in which you deploy the category of the museum and the structure of the museum for purposes of social intervention, for purposes of mobilization. Because what our task here is about imagining or enabling people to imagine themselves outside of the categories of colonialism. Now, there's a long history that I have with my students and my colleagues from East Africa, between East Africans and Southern Africans, where our East African colleagues speak a little bit more easily about tribe than Southern Africans. That tribe is tribe ethnicity? Is tribe indigenous? Or is tribe, because we require an indigeneity. We need an indigenous relationship with the land. But tribe was also such a vector of colonial domination and of separation and of the rule over the people, and what they called in the museum the peopling of Africa into tribes and races. And it's something that we really need to think about whether that is not one of our projects, to dismantle the category of tribe.
Sihar, it's so important all that you just said. I was just wondering if what you just said now could be one day reflected on legal papers transversal to the African continent and European countries, America, etc. What is the state of the affairs in that matter? Can you tell us a little bit?
In the matter of tribe?
Yeah, no, in the matter of, you talked about activism.
Yeah.
Okay, so this position where you imagine yourself out of the normal ways. Okay, so I know that everything is very slow and we have to move slow and accept this different speeds of different countries, but also there is situations where the pressure of legal implementation helps to activate a series of awarenesses. So, okay, not everything comes just for individual emancipation. Sometimes the rule, the words can also helps an open space for this, and everything can imagine to become a normalization. So I know that we all know about your ability to be, in all these different forums, activism, but also more legal and more formal forums. And I would like you to bring for us a little bit of this aspect of how do you see the future in terms of implementation of norms in museums among the European countries, despite of each different speed that we can observe. Okay.
These processes are already underway. The work of the International Inventories Program in Kenya is already affecting the concept of museum. The imaginary that is being put in place through just making inventories of return is generating a new kind of social museological energy. This reminds me of the meetings that were convened inter alia in Rio de Janeiro by UNESCO, who had been coming under pressure from Latin American museums, where some of the most radical forms of museum had emerged. Favela museums in Rio de Janeiro, Ecomuseu da Amazônia, museums of indigenous people in the Amazon. Amazingly interesting projects where the Brazilian Museums Association, IBRAM, had a department of social museology run by a team of brilliant young women who were implementing museum as movement, museum as process, not museum as government structure of the object. At ICOM, International Council of Museums, was present in that meeting, and they said, you people are opportunists who are wanting to take resources away from the solemn work of caring for collections for future generations. In other words, a defense of the conventional museum and the conventional definition. Now, in the last year, ICOM has been through an internal contestation about the definition. The new definition exists already. It is being implemented. We don't necessarily call it museum. We might be calling it work of restitution. But you are seeing the museum of the future emerging, where the museum is not a regulatory machine, where the museum is a space, museum is a forum, museum is an argument, museum is a knowledge relationship that places academic knowledge and community knowledge and the creativity of artists together into an equation and into a synergy with each other that have outcomes. such as exhibition production. This is what we mean by the museum as process, by the interrogative museum, where the museum has to be the space of citizenship. Now, it happens at different speeds, different paces, different quality, different questions, amidst all of the pressures that we have to conform. And it might be that restitution, the minimal ways in which 26 objects to Benin last week, 26 out of thousands, that restitution could become a means of hijacking an activist project. It could be a means of stalling and of regularizing what we do. But one needs to be watchful, that you need the presence of activism in order to hold on to these dynamics. Of course, you have a process of museumization that's underway, where ultimately, when the community comes and they give you their photographs or they give you their objects, you suddenly are caring for a collection and you get regularized and you have to do conservation. That is a technical process. But you also must never relinquish your internal expertise. That is paramount in your self-image, in your sovereignty, and in your destiny.
Okay, I have to say that I misread a little bit, going back to the question that was put by Maria One, actually. I misread this question, and he wanted also to address this question of academia to Siraj. And this can be linked to just what you said, because imagining that there are Mozambican researchers that are in the academia that are very interested on knowing more how to proceed in this direction, and normally can see Joburg, Cape Town as places where you could go to learn more and then bring back to Mozambique some kind of highlights to develop their. What could be your message to this young researcher from Mozambique?
You know, the interesting thing is that the intellectual developments that have taken place at Eduardo Mondlane Universidade, the presence of the Center for African Studies, the connections that we have to that university and to Mozambique through the murder of Ruth First, through the ways in which activist scholars, de Pelchin, etc., have circulated between Mozambique and South Africa and Congo, and the fact that at my university we have scholars of Mozambique. You know, we have Paulo Israel, we have Patricia Hayes, who've worked, you know, they've worked on photography, they've worked on Mapiko, all kinds of research. But we have learned from Mozambique, because if I think about the ways in which I, as a historian, made the accidental move to think about museums through studying, being a historian of race and a historian of physical anthropology and a historian of the dead body in the museum. And as an activist from District 6 in Cape Town, working to build the District 6 Museum as part of my civic activism, not part of my scholarship initially, I realized that actually the root of all of this thinking and critical thinking lies in an extremely decolonial disciplinary space that was created in Mozambique and that occurred in apartheid South Africa, as ironically in the space of African history. Now, Simone will tell you, you go to German universities, which is like 19th century disciplines, almost unchanged. It is inconceivable that there is such a thing called African history. Africans don't have history. You study African societies through the ethnological. You don't study. What do you mean African history? So just that move of insisting on the historicity of African societies, of thinking about orality and the value of orality and the messages of voice and what it means. Just thinking about artifacts and the evidence of the past brings up the question of the museum. In South Africa, of course, you know, as you would know, the central myth of a settler nation as white people try to localize themselves through the duty of care is they invented something that we call the fossil complex, in which indigenous people were constructed as living fossils. And so it placed them in this position of care, and they tied it to something that is now called the cradle of humankind. All of the work in paleoanthropology, in my view, as important as they are, the way they are celebrated does not admit a critique of the colonial nature of those ideas as they were formed. So we have much work to do, and we have work to do between South Africa and Mozambique. There is beautiful work that we are doing and that we have been prevented from doing through the pandemic with Quénia in the National Museum. And I look forward to being able to continue doing this work with all of you.
Thank you again, Siraj. It's so amazing to listen to you that we could, you know, spend 1 more hours or 2 hours listening. Our time is over, but I can't, you know, say goodbye before going back to Jim and Simon for final considerations. Please.
Oof. This is, anyway, let me just say that I think that the only way forward with this question is to be interdisciplinary about it and to look at the relations between oppressions. I think if Europe cannot see the connection between vaccine hoarding and the poor showing that they did at COP26 and the horrors of colonialism, if they feel like those are separate injustices, for us they're the same story, which is the same story of putting themselves above everyone, of separating themselves from nature, of separating themselves from Africans and making us subhuman. And so I'm struggling with the number of Europeans who consider those issues to be separate because they do not see that they are the same language of domination. I'm confused by this question of provenance science because my question is who frames the framework? I had a very condescending conversation with the person who was talking about provenance science, and I was asking them the same question that Siraj is asking. If a soldier was involved in an exchange, is that a gift or is there a gun involved? If a curator leaves Europe and comes to Africa and calls himself a tourist and then acquires things as a tourist and then goes back to Europe and is transformed again into a curator, has there been a falsehood there that then makes the provenance a little more kosher, but not morally improved? For me, these questions are moral questions, and as long as Europe continues to think of them as logistical rather than moral, we are not going to move forward. Thank you so much, Siraj. You really blessed me this evening, and thank you all.
Thank you, Jim. It's so great to listen to you and to you, Simone, too. Simone, I'll see you in Cologne.
Yes, looking forward.
Yeah.
It's all, Simon? You want?
I'm just happy to be part of this evening, and I also want to thank all of you again. And something interesting happened when Siraj talked today. I am thinking about him talking in Dresden, where I listened to him. I'm thinking of him talking in a talk about the fossil complex that he did 4 years ago or 3 years ago. You know, like there is this. There's a continuation for me where I'm just happy to learn and to listen to you, and yeah, so let's see what happens next.
Okay,
Thanks,
so it's clear.
to you, Katerina.
It's clear that you will come back as Simon and Jim too. I have just two small informations. So for all the audience, next week, this video will be subtitled in Portuguese, so everyone can have a full understanding of what was said. And also, I'd like to invite you for the next debate, and it's the last one, that will happen 1st of December. And we will talk about, what is about? Oh, it's this amazing speakers, Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy, that will come with Amadi Bakoum to talk about politics of African memory. So thank you again to everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you so much, Katerina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao. Thanks.
Thank you.